recording. I want to start off with a story for all of you, and it's because this week I really want us to be very honest about ourselves, if we can. And so I want to tell you about a thing that happened this week. We have some very special friends of ours that are going through some challenges right now. They are they're trying. So they called me yesterday morning, and I'm talking to them, and part of it has to do with the fact that Ben is being deployed to Portland as part of the anti stuff, right? But he called me because all of that was about his marriage, and so that's where I was called in as a pastor towards that. And I wanted to say, Ben, don't go to Portland because, right, I can't help but see the military there as being racist, as being anti many of the things we're talking about here. But I had to be quiet, it felt like, because I was in a different role, right? I was there as his pastor, counselor type of person rather than the voice of conscience in his life. And so that's been like bothering me the last 24 hours as I've been thinking about, should I have? Could I have? And that's a lot of what we're talking about today. Not that we all have these places where racism enters into us, and we have to decide what to do in that moment, how to do it, and how do we take a stance that is the best possible, and what do we do about the places where we can't do that. So I'm going to kind of try to put all of you on the spot a bit. Try to tell me some of where in your life, maybe not right now, but somewhere in your life where you have had to be faced with some of those things and you knew you didn't quite make the choice, the best choice, that you allowed your privilege to let you be one thing instead of another. Go ahead, Laura.
So this might not exactly be what you're looking for, but it's what comes to my mind. About 3 years ago, we had decided, we're out here in North Carolina, we decided to put a front lawn in, and I found this man who could do the work, and he came out, he spent a couple of days laying the turf already, he did a nice job. And the last day he was there, I went outside to pay him and to thank him for the work he did. And I think I kind of, because I was so stunned by what happened, I don't remember exactly the details, but he made a comment that had something to do with, anyway, he said something about those damn, and he used the N-word in our country. I was shocked and I froze. And I didn't say anything. I said, let me go get your check. And my passive aggressive way of getting back at him was to not smile when he left. That was the extent of my response. I felt ashamed of that ever since. Yeah. And I hope that today, if something like that happened, I would let you know that that's not acceptable language, and certainly not on my property, and that he would never be welcome in my home again. So, you know, but I didn't. I just got quiet.
Yeah. But the problem is that surprise often happens to you. None of the rest of us have ever been in a surprising situation and made it so that we were dumbfounded in the moment, right? And that's part of the issue, right? Is that all of a sudden that happens, and 5 minutes later we're saying, why didn't I? Right? Yeah. Anybody else? How is it that you've essentially seen that you've benefited from white privilege?
I'm Sandra, and a number of years ago, my African American friend was stopped on the freeway and pulled over, and she was so embarrassed, and she was treated so badly that she gave up driving. And she came and told us at lunch, a group of us at lunch, and we were all, the rest of us were all white, and not one of us we all sympathized with her, but not one of us took any action to go down to the police station or help her make a complaint.
Mhm.
And I ended up about 6 weeks ago writing her a note of apology when she brought that up.
Thank you, Sandra. Because because that's part of the thing is we get to not be in those kinds of situations as much as the one who the wrong action is being perpetrated on. And so it's really easy for us to not step forward, isn't it? Thank you. Anyone else?
I don't know if this qualifies as exactly what you're looking for, but it was an experience that was just, I get emotional when I think of it. After I separated from my husband, so this was about 8 years ago, I decided I was taking a look at what I wanted to do as a single person that I hadn't done before. And one of the things was I really wanted to dance. And so I went to a couple of places and was dancing. And then I met this Black woman who was an incredible dancer. And so I asked her if I could just copy everything she did. Would she be offended if I did that? You know, if I could just shadow her so I could really learn, because she was just phenomenal. So she was very gracious. That was fine. We had a great time, and we did that for a long time. I never got to be as good as she was, but we had great fun doing it. And one day she had pretty long hair. She got it cut very short, and it was very tight, curly. You know, the word nappy comes to my mind, which is totally inappropriate to say. And so I rubbed the top of her head. She was sitting down, I was standing up, and I had just come to greet her. And she socked me in the face so hard, I was seeing stars. I don't know how I didn't end up on the floor. And she said, "Don't you ever touch a Black woman's head." And you know, I was just astonished that I had done something that was so offensive to her without thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I, you know, totally apologized and tried to talk to her. She wouldn't talk to me. We eventually were able to talk it through, but it was, you know, maybe a month later. And, you know, I'd like to talk to myself and tell myself that if she had been white, I would have done the same thing if she had the same type of hair. And I don't know, it was just a, you know, a wake up experience to me. And it really made me think about what a demeaning thing that is to touch someone else's head.
Yeah. Thank you for your honesty, Maureen, because that's exactly part of where all of this is at, is are we aware of what we're doing, what we're saying, what's happening, or does it just pass us by? Luckily, you had somebody who right then was that helped you be very aware.
Well,
and,
I've never been hit in my life.
Yeah. And that's the challenge, isn't it? Is that sometimes that's what happens, is it feels like it's who knows why she reacted so strongly, what was going on in her, and what allowed her to be the very strong voice in your life. But as the author said here, silence is not benign. And so that voice, even though it felt harsh, is not necessarily a bad thing. Leticia, I saw your hand.
I can speak from the receiving end with authorities. Years ago, my daughter's 40. She was 18 years old. Raves were all the rave at the time. When she came home and announced, "I'm an adult, I'm going to produce raves," which at the time were illegal.
You grab that, Ash.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
That's my fault.
Oh, okay. And I was producing concerts at the time. So I said, I'll show you how to do it so the cops don't come after you. What you have to do to make sure that the kids that are going there are going to be safe. So I did this whole thing with her. She did a subsequent one with a partnership up in Phoenix. And I went up because I was footing some of the bill on that. And at the time I drove a 1983 Jaguar XJS, sharp looking gray car. And those raves start at 9 o'clock and go until the morning. So about 1 o'clock, I decided I'm too old, I'm going home. Driving back from Phoenix, I stopped at Sacaton, the rest area at Sacaton. And there were highway patrolmen and border patrolmen there. I get out of my car, I wave. I come back, I wave. I leave, I wave. Mile down the road, there are two, they weren't INS cars. And I made note of it, and within a quarter of a mile, they're going to stop me. So they did the normal, you know why we stopped you, ma'am, right? And I said, no, I don't. Why don't you tell me? Well, in Arizona, they can't stop a single car for a routine drug driving test. Our law says that if they're going to do random checks for drunk drivers, it has to be by where they stop the freeway and everybody gets checked. And I said, no, sir, this isn't a random check because you're not allowed to do this. Why did you really stop me? The only thing that saved me was the highway patrol came, and I happened to ask him if he knew my brother-in-law. At that time, my brother-in-law was like top cop for the highway patrol for 5-6 years. Then I asked him if they knew my sister, his wife. And she was their dispatcher, so they knew her. That was the only thing that kept me from being arrested, because I was in a fancy car in a nice outfit in the middle of the night, so I must be suspect of something. It's hard, and like Maureen, you never understood about the hair. With the Black community, the nappy hair, they've spent so many years trying to straighten it out.
I understand now, and I think
yeah, and it's hard. I've made that mistake too. I got it too. So
at least part of the point of this exercise is for us all to realize that we all have made the mistakes. Right? It's because we all have come out of a space of less awareness
right.
of racism that now we've surpassed, but being continually aware so that we learn in this moment what is still in front of us. That's what it's about. So where else have you in your past at some moment or another failed? Who else has had a not quite perfect racial past? I want you to be really honest about that. And at the end of the class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a self-assessment tool. It's actually the last page or so of this chapter. And I want you to put it somewhere where every day you'll read it and ask yourself the questions, essentially. And try to figure out where is it, how is it that I have been imperfect. And the reason for that is by recognizing how we haven't done it right, we position ourselves to make better choices as we go forward. One of the lines that struck me in this in this chapter was this. It has not been African Americans who resist integration efforts. It has always been whites.
Yeah, right on.
We as a race, because of our position of power, have very often been that which stands in the way of. Because why? We benefit from. Right? And we have to figure out how to be aware of how it is that right here in this moment, I'm resisting rather than helping. Art.
Yeah, Kennedy makes a similar point, which I hadn't heard before, but he says that systemic racism came first, not personal or individual racism. That we recognized long ago the advantages exploiting African Americans to bring them over here, treat them unfairly to get, because it was profitable for us. And then we had to justify it. And so to justify it, we dropped down to personal racism in the sense that you were saying, well, they're not really human. They're not like us. They're not as smart as us, only 2/3 of a citizen.
Yeah.
So he kind of flipped it around, which I thought was an interesting point of view.
Right. In fact, he goes so far as to say racism precedes race.
Yeah.
So race was a made-up concept that came after our division of each other and the prejudice that got put into action. Kendi is a really important author right now, and if we do another book after this, the one I'd like to do is his book about anti-racism, how to be an anti-racist, because that's what we're moving towards. We don't want to just be people who aren't racist. We want to be against racism. We want to be fighting that within ourselves and around us that is perpetuating racism. But to do that, we have to see the racism.
I would support that, Jim. That book had a profound effect on me. Just the way, so many things to think about.
Right. And the tough part about it is that the easiest thing for all of us to do is position ourselves as innocent of race. You know why we can do that easily? Because our parents were worse than us usually. Right? Our surroundings are filled with people that are more racist than we are. As he described some of how racism was defined in America, it makes it easy for us to say, well, I'm not that. We'll get to that more when we get to the second chapter about the good bad binary. But all of that makes it so that if we're not careful, we excuse the racism in ourselves and don't see it as well around us. And visibility means everything in this. Are we watching and being aware of it so that we take a different action? Go ahead, Laura.
So I find myself struggling with two issues right now around all of this. One is, as D'Angelo says, knowing how to disrupt the system and figuring out what that means for me personally. And also, I'm struggling with how to interact with people of color right now without really embarrassing them and myself, because I find myself wanting to go up to people of color right now and just looking them right in the eye and saying, I am so sorry. I am going to do whatever I can to make this better, but that's not always appropriate. We hired at work 2 weeks ago a young Black woman, and I did that the other day. I've hardly gotten to know her, but I couldn't stop myself. I went into her office and I said, I'm waking up and I'm really sorry and I want to be an ally. And I know we don't know each other very well, but maybe someday when we do, but I'm not sure that was appropriate. I didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable, but I felt this urge to say something. So I'm struggling on these two levels of what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
What was her?
I think we all are to some extent, because trying to figure out right now what is the best action is, it's not a simple, here's 1, 2, 3, do this and you'll be perfect. Right? Part of it is being in a space where maybe an apology at some point is appropriate. But you know where an apology is always most appropriate? When you're in relationship with the person already. And so relationship is key to this, right? I think that's where you always want to start in any of these spaces, is go to where you are meeting your friend as a friend on equal ground, so you can be honest and they can be honest too.
Yeah, I think we have to do some things politically. I mean, it's one thing to talk about this in a personal fashion, but others are going to be more personal. It's hard for me to grasp that in 30 years, whites, the whites, those of Northern America and Northern European ancestry, will be one of the minorities, and we will be a country of minorities. And we have to end the white superiority. I could preach about this for a long time, but I'm going to stop with that.
Yeah. But I think at least part of what you're talking about, Harvey, is what the Baldwin quote was about. Did you see the James Baldwin quote? It's a pretty long quote.
Yeah.
On page 65, where it says, I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that. And then he begins to list different types of things. I know that, Sunday is the most segregated hour. I know that I'm not in their union because they don't let me. All kinds of things like that. We have to begin looking at things like that, which we might not see because it doesn't affect me in the same way. I'm not the one who's excluded from. How do I though open my eyes so that I see that somebody else is?
We feel a little impotent too, because we're just a single person trying to fight this big system.
That's right.
How do we grab it? How do we get a hold of it?
But we're not just single people. We are in community. We are St. Francis, for example. And St. Francis can have more political power than one person alone. We can also be part of PCIC, and PCIC has some voice and power. We can be part of the Methodist Church. We can be part of that which goes and lobbies down at the state capitol. There's lots of ways we can be part of that larger voice if we take the time and the effort to do that. Go ahead, Leticia.
It's not so much about needing to apologize. And like I said last week, I'm coming to know everybody, and I'm very confident saying that everybody that comes into this class is very well intended, dots their I's and crosses their T's, and is very intentional in how they interact with people. What many minorities that I've worked with, and I've said it before, it's not so much an apology. It's not even, it's helping them change the justice system. It's
right.
Hearing their story and their inability, no matter how hard they try, that they're not able to, privilege that they focus on the most is the advantages, is the education system, where people in inner cities are watching whites move out to the suburbs and then turn around and say, look at how they live, how terrible it is. But
yeah,
that economic impact has a lot to do with that.
because even if a person in the inner city wants to buy a home, they're probably going to have to pay more than that home is really worth. And they're going to have to pay a higher interest, and they're going to have to pay more down to get that home.
Harvey, do you know where that started?
Well,
in the late 80s, the federal government told the banking system, if you have a bank in a particular neighborhood, You
Sure.
have to invest back into that neighborhood X amount of money. And that was to help with faulty infrastructure, developers that left the neighborhood without sidewalks and curbs and that kind of thing. Rather than adhere to that, the bank started saying, well, we don't have enough deposits here, so we're going to close these banks. So
Yeah.
they took
Like-
that opportunity away from the minorities. And I took an art history class, and I kind of focused some of my writing on urban renewal. We talked about that last week. And part of what made the most sense to me from a historian's concept was that in order to support entrepreneurs, you need less expensive areas so that they have affordable storefronts, affordable access to buildings to start a business from the ground up. Once you build a business, then you need to go and buy new warehouses someplace else. So we're not thinking in even that level. The Latinos are very entrepreneurial in spirit. But if you go in and say, this is the wrong side of the track, it's getting kind of so, but we're going to go in the barrio and we're going to bring back the culture. And they're not doing that, because in order to bring back the culture, you need to bring back the people. And that's where the resentment, whether it's Hispanic or Black or any minority, but a lot of the minorities, especially the Black and the Hispanics, family and friends and that neighborhood is so integral that those kinds of things, it's not just how we treat each other, it's seeing that kind of stuff and helping them build their own communities back up rather than come in and gentrify them and displace them.
That's right.
Yeah, gentrification is a real problem.
Yeah.
So how many know, how many think that you can fix all things racism in your world? I was struck by the one line.
Everything, but we better start fixing
Yeah.
something. And
Yeah.
laws are one of the basic things.
Yeah.
When 60% of the people who are in jail now, and this was the same when I was a chaplain in a jail 50 years ago, 60% of those people are Black and 35% are Latino.
Yeah. Yeah. I was struck by this line where he's going along and he's talking about that we should consider models for child development and its stages. Are there ways that teachers and the educational system are still running under a whites only model and not seeing that maybe some of that development is different according to different different spaces that kids may come from? And the good news is that educational models are looking at that better. Joni thinks about things like that much better than when I was a teacher. You saw the story that she read on Sunday, many of you did. There were not many stories like that when I stopped teaching at the end of the 1990s, right? And so that has changed, but that's been a very concerted effort by some people in that community to make that change. And that's what has to happen in all of these areas that you're talking about. Who begins to start the conversation? Who begins to force the issue? Who pushes so that something begins to happen? And the answer to all those questions has to be you. Not because you're going to solve all the issues, but you start to find the ones where you see something and you begin to do something. It comes back to the image that they gave. Didn't you think that was an interesting image where she's talking about if you're walking down the street and people are shoving money in your pockets, you can't just act like you don't see it. You know that it's happening. Do we choose to see where we are being benefited and then work to change that. Not necessarily because I cut back mine, but that I raise and work towards making it so that everyone else has that same privilege. Because I'm guessing that most everyone would love a few dollars stuck into their pockets every once in a while. You know what I'm saying?
That's the same issue with charter schools.
That's right.
That's right.
So what we need to do is bring every public school.
That's exactly right. So the question really comes down to, how is it that you are going to, instead of just letting race shape your life for the negative or for your benefit, maybe I should say, how are you going to be part of that which allows race to shape all of life better? Because race is present. You see how she's very clear about that? Race is present in us. That's part of what's there. And for us to try to be colorblind to it doesn't help. It helps when we start working towards making it a positive rather than the negative for some of us. So what's your issue? Yes, Joyce.
Martin Luther King had written, I think it was a writing, or it may have been in a speech, but his words were something to the effect that all people, he looked forward to the day that all people would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And I've taken those words to heart, and I kind of try to live by that. And the one thing that, if I can just play devil's advocate just a little bit, the one thing that I have seen myself, the effect of certain things on other people, and I don't know how to deal with that, because it's what we're suffering from now, I think. That the efforts that were made in integration back in the, I'm going to say the late 60s, where the schools, especially the colleges, were forcibly integrating Black people into college life and everything. And in a way that's good, but in the way it's bad, because what I saw and what I have heard people experience was that a lot of people, a lot of Black people, were given kind of a free ride, where they were coming from poorer schools, less education than other people had. And I'm not saying white people, but people in general, people who had really applied themselves and worked very hard in high school and got to the college level. And they tried, they were doing the best they could. And then they were on like a grading curve or whatever. They were sort of tossed aside and given an unfair ride when it came to having Black people in the classroom that were given more advantages. And I know it's not exactly speaking to the white fragility, where white people are given more advantages, but if you have two children in your family and you favor one over the other, the child that is not the child that is less favored is going to resent that. And so I see that as being a problem in today's society, that a lot of those people that were given unfair advantage in college back in the late 60s and 70s are now in positions of power, and they're the ones that do hiring and the decision making as to what schools get the most money and all that kind of thing. and they're taking it out in those neighborhoods. So I don't know. I don't know how to solve it other than, we just need a culture of letting it be known that all people should be treated equally, and this is what we stand for. Not that one group or another group gets an unfair advantage. Just, am I?
Yeah, we often talk about affirmative action, but we don't realize how far ahead the white community is generally beyond the Black and Latino communities. And so it's sort of like running a race. If you got a 100-yard dash and you put the person at the 50-yard line and say you could take off at the same time, and the other person has to catch up. I mean, that's the best analogy I can think of.
Right.
What affirmative action we often overlook is to help bring those up who've not had that chance. And I could preach on this for hours, so I'm going to stop.
So let me take it in a different direction, because what you're talking about is really the next chapter, the good bad binary, and I'll make that connection in a second. But let me tie a bow on the end of this chapter and show you this. This is some of the last part of the chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And I titled it A Fierce and Honest Examination of Conscience. And I want you to periodically during this next week, look at this and ask yourself deeply about each of these things. How is it that all of this is happening to you? How is it?
I'm in a book group online here.
How is it that your racism
why I had to move
is
when
still
the
present?
carpet was going. Okay, it didn't take you very.
How is it that these things are still playing themselves out in you? Okay, and so I'll send that to you as soon as this class is over so that you've got that. But do that examination and so that you know where you're at and you can continue to do that. But then let's talk about what do we do with the us. And here's the bottom line. Okay, so one of my, what I believe is one of the great evils in our world today is dualism. And it was a thing that's it's more ancient than Jesus. Started around Plato, probably even before that, but he was the one who codified it into this thing that everything's put into a series of twos, a good and a bad one, right? And guess what we tend to say when we put something into twos? Well, you're in the bad side, but I'm in the good side, right? So we do things for our own advantage because we're good. We codify ours as being the right thing, and we position the other person, the opposition, so to speak, as being the wrong thing. And that's rarely helpful. Right at the beginning of chapter 5, she made the point that after the civil rights movement of the 60s, that suddenly we said, okay, racism is bad. We see that acting like that is bad. And so let's just act like we're all not racist. Don't act racist. Not acting racist is not a bad thing, but when we make it so that we hide all the things that are making it so that one person has something and another person can't get it, it is bad.
Yeah.
Okay? And so just putting it that way is wrong. What we have to do is figure out in each moment, how is it that we react to this person in front of me? And how do we do that collectively so that we maximize our systems for everyone in the best way possible? As Harvey said, some of our practices in the past have left some people at a disadvantage. And so today we have to have something that makes adjustments for that disadvantage. And how do we do that in a way that doesn't disadvantage somebody else in the process? Affirmative action was an attempt to do that. The hard part is any system like that, like affirmative action proves, is going to have some inherent problems to it. We have to make sure we don't see the problems more than what the advantages are. I'm sorry, go ahead.
the way that I see that though is that there isn't a whole lot you can do with adults to put them in a more advantageous position without
There is.
without putting someone else in a less advantaged position, to make the scales even. But you can do it starting at the grade school level and getting everyone a good education, making sure that all children have a good education, and that certain groups of people or certain neighborhoods aren't less advantaged or
Yes.
disadvantaged.
Yeah, so let's talk about that in particular. In our system today, what's in place that makes it so that some people get advantages rather than others? What are some of the things that are in place?
The legal system.
Neighborhoods,
And the legal system.
neighborhoods.
Yeah,
Tax bases.
tax bases, that's exactly right. Those poor neighborhoods, for example, they have less tax base. So guess which schools struggle to be able to fund themselves. But
Right.
what do rich areas do in response to that? Why are they getting more money than us?
Yeah.
Where do the
Well,
majority of our older schools reside?
What happens is the excess ends up being held. And it's held by the school, and they create all kinds of additional experiences for the children. Instead of saying, take my excess, put it over on the other side of town.
Yeah.
Where that other child is.
Yeah.
Instead, my kids, excuse us, both Mike and I are on, so this is confusing. They bust my kids to the other side of town and reverse integration, if you would hear it that way. But it really wasn't. All they did was show up at school in a separate classroom. There was no integration at all. It was a false narrative that was painted. Our kids rode 40 minutes just to go to school on the other side of town.
The hard part about education, can I tell you the bottom line about why all those questions I asked just a little bit ago are hard to answer? Is because no school is fully funded. Your richest school needs more money.
Yeah.
Okay? And so they know that if you take this away, you're taking away some program that will benefit the children in this school. So the ultimate answer is not to take money away from the rich schools and give it to the poor schools. It is to fund things fully.
Mhm.
And until we start making that type of decision to fully fund what needs to be funded, we're going to have a problem. But why don't we fund schools fully?
Because it's going to cost us more money.
Tim,
It's going to cost us more money. And who complains less? Who has the worst lobbies around? Not the business
the
community.
poor people.
Definitely not the prison communities,
No,
right?
right.
We have to stand up and care about things like that. And we have to start figuring out what needs to be defunded because we're spending money there that if we spend it ahead of time or in a different way, it will spend that money better.
Mhm.
We're spending an awful lot of our budget right now on prisons.
Yep.
At
Right.
the expense of what?
I think that brings up another, that it isn't only the money that the schools are lacking, it's also the strife that these children are coming to school with. My daughter's a teacher in one of the districts here that's a very poor, impoverished district. And these kids are coming with parents who are drug problems, fights. There's a lot of emotional turmoil going on, and the schools are not supposed to be therapists, but I really think that we certainly need behavioral components that work with them instead of expelling them and sending them home to play games for 3 days and not really learn how to improve their behavior or what to do differently.
Yeah, but let's examine the backstory of that, Maureen. Let's say that there is more broken marriages in a poorer neighborhood. Why aren't we as a system, not in the educational system alone, but in our governmental system, putting more social services into that area so that there's more counseling for those parents? So there's more ways to be able to help support and mend those families that are broken. Why aren't we doing that? If that is where we're identifying that's a problem, why isn't that a priority for our spending?
Well,
places where they're doing it,
pardon?
but none as successfully or magnanimously like we'd like to believe is possible.
Right. Earlier in the book, she made the point that, I think it was in this book, that the neighborhoods where we spend more money on police enforcement and things, where we spend money on doing things that way, are safer neighborhoods. But we're not doing that in our poorer neighborhoods, right? We're not giving them the social support for them to be a safer neighborhood. Why don't we? Leticia.
I'd like to ask everybody, because I'm hearing one thing over and over again, whether it has to do with affirmative action or what we're talking about at this moment, is that when we're discussing this, not to begin your thoughts with a broad sweeping statement.
Yeah.
Because I think I'm a big proponent that we've been subject to social engineering for the last 50 years. But when we look at this and say, those people who got affirmative action, these neighborhoods that are doing this, we're not opening ourselves up to eventually go into those neighborhoods and have a discussion and actually see that. I gotta tell you, there's still a lot of Hispanic families that are whole families.
Yes.
They stay together.
That's exactly right.
But the information out there is all these families are broken families, and there's all this stuff. But that's true for white neighborhoods too.
That's right.
And we have to acknowledge that as our community, our greater community concern, not just a minority, but everybody. We didn't get to what, 58% divorce rate or higher, with it just being the minorities that are suffering from it.
That's right.
On page 79 and going to 80, she makes a point. Differential treatment in itself is not the problem. We need to, in fact, she says, treat each other differently. We need to look at each person, and we need to say, Sandra doesn't need the same relationship with me as what Mary does. Mary obviously needs a whole bunch more correction. I'm just kidding, Mary. We have to treat everyone.
No, I'm sitting.
Yeah. We have to treat everyone
Tom,
according to what they truly need, not necessarily in the same way. Okay? But then she goes on to say this. The problem is the misinformation that circulates around us and causes our differential treatment to be inequitable. Okay? So if I say you're good and you're bad, and I allow that to make it so that I treat you better than somebody else, that's where the problem is at. How are we in every time, in every moment, looking at every situation and at the situations as a whole and trying to do the most equitable thing? That doesn't mean equal. It's what will help everyone have what they need the most. How do we do that? The problem is we do a whole bunch of differential treatment that is not equitable.
Give me an example.
If we say, for example, we have to have one type of sidewalk throughout our city, no matter what, no matter whether the neighborhood needs it, wants it, values it, versus something else. So one part of the city may say, I'd like sidewalks, but I'd sure like a after-school center more. Are we willing to listen and see that after-school center is more important than the making of sidewalks in that part of the city? Does that make sense? Are we listening to what is needed in every part of the city and maximize all the needs?
What you're saying is we're making a blanket statement, like Letitia said, that everybody in the city is going to be equal and have an equal sidewalk, when in fact, that's not what they need. Nobody even asked them what they really needed.
Yeah.
And the reason the mothers, the children are from families with only a mother is the husband can't get a job because of the color of his skin or the disadvantage of the education or lack of education. It's a lot bigger than it is for them, quote unquote, of color, than it is for me. I can walk in anywhere and at least get an interview.
Yeah. And the question is, are we aware of that? And are we trying to adjust our system, not just ourselves, because it's enough to adjust ourselves. That's a lot of work. But we also have to work on our system so that our system is beginning to ask those same types of questions. We need our system to be anti-racist. And that takes a lot of work to do. Evelyn, did I see your hand?
Yeah, and one thing too with some big broad blanket statement, you know, we are a democratic republic, which means we start at the bottom. We don't go top down. It's a bottom up system. And the best way to tackle these is start in your local communities and build with people. You can put all these blanket laws. There's literally hundreds of laws on the federal books, but they're not enforced. And the best way to do it is round up where you can meet people, interact, ask the questions for the needs, like you mentioned, and get action done within your own little community or city, and let it grow. It'll fester and grow and spread. You can't force it from the top down. It has to be supported. You have to have a solid foundation on the bottom for it to work.
The nice thing about Tucson is, you know, I've been here now 6 years, and Regina is an amazingly approachable person as our mayor. Many of our county superintendents and city council people are amazingly approachable people. Do we go to them and talk to them? Are we involved in our local government that way? Right? Now, here's the bad part. It doesn't mean that because I know Regina that she's going to do everything my way. Right? But it does mean that she's willing to be heard. I mean, willing to listen and let me be heard and other people be heard. Are we in those spaces where we are trying to let that happen? And not just fighting for myself, but fighting for those bigger questions.
I think that's part of the problem, that we haven't dealt with what the biggest problems.
Yeah.
We haven't come to a consensus on what our values are. And that's where the body of the church ought to be working now.
Yeah. Yeah. The good news is we have a few more weeks to be able to solve that issue, Harvey. Don't have to fix it yet tonight. Right at the end. Yes.
That issue that I brought up about figuring out how to get cable to those families that don't have cable internet service and they're faced with trying to teach their kids online. I'm getting several phone calls back. I reached out to Univision and Telemundo. So
Let me,
they are going to get me a list of contacts and make introductions for me.
yeah, let me interrupt and tell everyone the larger context. The question is this: as schools are reopening, how is it easier in some neighborhoods than others? Who has internet connections and who doesn't? You know, how is it that just the very unusual circumstances of opening up school districts this year make it so that it might widen some of the gaps where the richer districts, richer areas of the city are able to maximize their education while the poorer areas lose out? And what do we do to help balance that? How can we be present? So that's one of the things that Leticia is working on, is to try to answer that type of equitable question.
Mhm.
So think about it. Look through that thing that I'm going to send to you. I'm also going to give you a flyer for a workshop, a series of workshops coming up through the UCC Church, the United Church of Christ, which is called Working with Social Justice and Solidarity with the Black Community. And it's 3 seminars on the 1st, the 8th, the 15th, and the 22nd. Okay, and I'll send that out to you so you've got that.
Great.
Begin to ask the questions of how to get involved in ways that are more than just how do you profit, but how does our city, how does our state, how does our world become better? Okay. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for your thoughtfulness in this issue. Appreciate
Thanks for leading us, Jim.
Thanks, everyone.
it. Bye bye.
Jim.
Bye-bye.